A few summers ago, I decided to take a leap of faith, quite literally. Skydiving had always been on my bucket list, and on my 32nd birthday, I decided it was time to take the plunge alone. I'd spent almost 2 months leading up to the big jump practicing and getting prepared to fly solo, essentially. By the time I was committed to a solo jump, I'd successfully taken the plunge attached to an instructor twice before. As I suited up and boarded the plane, I remember having a strong mix of excitement and anxiety. My heart racing as a result of both. I realized the anticipation of going at it alone was so much more brutal. The adrenaline pumping through my veins, it was like nothing I'd experienced before. Second thoughts came flooding in, intrusive ones too, but there was no time for that. The moment had arrived. So, with a deep breath and a leap from the aircraft, immediately I felt totally weightless, soaring through the open sky. The initial rush was breathtaking. The world around me seemed to blur as I embraced the exhilarating freedom of being alone. And why is it that the moment you think this is perfect or Hakuna Matata, you're rudely reminded that's not the case? I thought everything was going perfectly until an unexpected gust of wind caught me off guard. No, off course entirely. The moment it happened, I struggled to locate my pull cord as it was ripped from my hands. I reached for the thing and pulled as hard as I could. I knew I couldn't technically pull it too early, but I could pull it too late, so I pulled, and I felt nothing but resistance. My chute had failed. Suddenly, I found myself spiraling out of control, and that weightlessness feeling was now turning into something disorienting. I wondered if I'd pass out before I hit the ground. I hoped that I would. In moments of clarity, all I could see was that the ground below was getting closer with each passing second. Panic set in, but I knew that I had to keep a clear head if I wanted to make it out of this alive. Instinctively, I reached for my emergency parachute, and I pulled the cord with all my might. The sudden jolt brought me to a halt, and my body jerked as the secondary parachute deployed. I let out the sigh of relief, but my ordeal was far from over. I was off course. Suspended thousands of feet above the ground, I had to navigate my way back to safety. In those moments of floating back down to reality, all the trivial worries and stresses seemed insignificant. I was grateful for the opportunity to experience such a rush. Especially since I had survived it. I'd eventually landed with a thud, a few scrapes and bruises, but I was on solid ground again. And call me crazy, but I continue to skydive to this day. I just carry a newfound respect for the unpredictable nature of the world. Excuse my intrusive thoughts for a moment. Please know I'm not thinking of offing myself, and I hope this question doesn't trigger anyone. But there's something I've been wondering about, and I can't really quiz my coworkers with an icebreaker like this. So, here goes. If you were to jump off a building, would you face forward or backward when you leapt? There's pros and cons for each direction, I think. Facing forward, you're given the chance to know exactly when your death will be, as the hustle and bustle of the city life continues. I'd imagine a joyous warmth would engulf the soul, reminiscent of Christmas morning as a child, when the wonders of Santa Claus still exist. Maybe, able to witness all that you'll leave behind. The men and women going to and from work with no purpose besides filling their pockets for a weekend distraction from reality. The imagery of your impact on the concrete will be seen by at least a few of them. The sudden carnage that lays before them is bound to be retained within their psyche. It may even be enough to change their purpose in life, ignite the inspiration they were missing. Maybe not. Who knows? Or you could jump backwards. You think you'd only indulge this option on a day with clear skies in the forecast. Consider leaving early in the morning or late afternoon for the best chance of a picture-perfect sky to gaze into. It's superior in aesthetics compared to the dingy streets being the last image you'll see, but you won't know how long that image will be able to be cherished. Personally, I feel like it would force my attention on trying to soak it all in, instead of appreciating the last moment of my final artistic gesture. There's millions of actors all dancing to their own music on the world stage. Unfortunately, my husband ALISHA was unintentionally in the audience during someone's final performance. I can say truthfully that the trauma he experienced by seeing it stuck with him years later, and clearly his retelling of the events haven't left me either. In 2018, ALISHA is on a construction job in Lower Manhattan. He's one of the leads on this project and had to be the first one on site to unlock the gates surrounding the construction zone. On a typical morning in August, ALISHA's just finished pulling the chains off the last fence at the yard. The last gate he's opening is across the street from the Deschutes Bank Center. Also attached to that same building is the Mandarin Oriental Hotel and some ultra-expensive luxury apartments. When ALISHA gets the last lock, he slides the key back into his pocket while turning around. It was a clear summer morning, and as he looked up to really take in the morning sunrise, he also saw a man stepping off of the 55-story building, then falling over 750 feet. ALISHA told me the man landed on the glass mark of the hotel with such force it sounded like a bomb had gone off. The impact would split the man's body in half, sending bloody pieces of him flying in multiple directions. Some even landed across the street into the construction site. Emergency vehicles shut down the whole block within a few minutes. Soon, ALISHA was able to return home after relocking all of the gates in a dazed shock. When he got home, he told me what happened. I saw the small spots of blood that freckled his yellow vest. When he first came in and told me, I thought that he was lying because of how nonchalantly he had retold before going to the shower. Pretty sure he was still in shock. That night, however, I'd woken up to ALISHA thrashing in bed with night terrors, jolted awake by one of his kicks to see him punching his arms violently into the darkness, or screaming. He's asleep the whole time while acting this way too. ALISHA's mom told me that he used to have a sleepwalking problem in high school, but nothing close to what he was doing now. I asked ALISHA what he'd been seeing in his dreams, but he either wouldn't or couldn't talk about it. 3 days later, work would call him, telling him they'd been okayed to return to the site the next day. ALISHA speechless on the phone. Then he quickly ended the call and dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor of our dining room. He then sits on the floor, and for the first time since the incident, he cries. We sat on the floor together, and ALISHA told me about his nightmares, about how that morning plays over and over and over. Every night he's either in his truck getting to work or already at the last gate. And every time he sees the man plummet through the glass canopy of the hotel, the body splits into two when it hits the road. Sometimes one of the parts or both would reanimate back to life, crawling towards ALISHA, dragging whatever pieces were still attached to it at the side. It's really some dark shit that I don't need to keep going further with. There's just something so wildly insane about having your life changed forever in such a brutal way by someone that you've never even met. Anyway, take care everyone, and thanks for listening. After college, for several years, my friends and I would get together the day before Thanksgiving, We would eat food, play games, and get super drunk. Maybe you've heard of this tradition. We referred to it fondly as Friendsgiving, and when I was about 25, we celebrated our final one together as a group, and let's just say it was one to remember. 2 friends of ours had bought property out in Deer Park, Washington, a couple of months before the holidays, and they invited us to celebrate Friendsgiving out there as a sort of housewarming party too. We all lived in Eastern Washington at the time, so we opted to just carpool there, 4 of us in one car. It should have been a quick trip, one that we were even somewhat familiar with to a certain point. It was a Tuesday night, and the final road to our friend's house was a long stretch of nothingness. As we started getting closer to what we thought was our destination, we were suddenly aware that we were being followed. I think it was my friend who was driving, Blake, who noticed first and then called it to the attention of the rest of the car. The music was turned down, and suddenly we were all looking out the back window. It wasn't just that there was a car following us on this seemingly desolate road. It was how close they were following us. I remember audibly gasping at that realization, and my friend Summer did the same as we instinctively grabbed each other's hands. The headlights were almost blinding as Blake asked us, "Can you see the driver? What's up?" I hear my friend in the front seat echo his question. I focused, trying to see anything but the blinding headlights. It seemed as though we should be able to make out the driver, but from this angle he resembled nothing more than a large dark silhouette. I was taken aback by the headlights once again. They were so unusual, and I recall thinking that I'd never seen headlights quite like that. But I realized I sure had, on really old cars. They were perfectly round and slightly raised from the car itself. Just as I thought I'd state these facts out loud, it got even closer. "You just need to let them pass. Pull over or speed up," Summer ordered Blake from the back seat next to me. Pretty soon, Blake was having to drive so fast to avoid the car tailing us that he couldn't safely pull off the road. I could see the car clearly now. It was a very old antique-style car. I don't know enough about cars to do much, but I know enough to know that that car was a classic. Who drives a classic car so recklessly? I remember asking out loud. No answer from within. By now, the car became filled with fear and angst. Finally, Blake made the split decision to pull off on a gravel shoulder, which was practically non-existent. The car was still right on our ass as we pulled off. Summer and I were screaming as we realized they were the closest they'd been to our car yet, and we could see that there were multiple silhouettes in the car. We immediately felt a jolt as the car hit our back end. Blake struggled for a moment to regain control of his car. We weren't headed for a cliff or anything, but it was pitch black out there, and we knew that we were surrounded by giant trees. As the car spun, my eyes spun in the direction of the other car. Looking from each window of the car, I could still see the antique vehicle, until suddenly it disappeared. I don't mean that it sped off or anything like that. I mean that we watched it disappear. As he pulled off to the side, we confirmed there was nothing there. It didn't follow us, it didn't pass us or keep driving. It completely disappeared off the road, and there was no explaining where the car had gone. "Where the hell did they go?" Blake asked his passengers, and no one said a thing. I believe we were all in shock, but still, looking at the road behind us, expecting to see something. After a few moments, Blake gets out of the car and looks for any sort of damage to his car. When he got back in, he told us there was no damage, not even a scratch on his car. Still, we were all sure that we had seen someone, a car, following us. Not only that, but we all felt the jolt from the impact. Yet we also agreed that we'd seen something disappear right before our eyes. Either way, Blake started driving back into the road and continued to follow the GPS to our friend's house. We were all sorts of quiet, not sure what to say or think about what had just happened. When we got to our friend's house, we told them about the experience. Them not having been in the car with us, I guess it was just hard for them to believe. I asked them, did any other cars drive down this road, especially in the last 10 minutes? No. They were the only occupied property along this road. The rest was either undeveloped or protected land. So, what the hell did we experience? Nothing, and I mean nothing, will ever be more eventful than the Thanksgiving I had in 2005. I was meeting my boyfriend's family for the first time. They were hosting us along with his sister and her boyfriend. Okay, names. My boyfriend at the time was named Arden, his sister's name was Valina, and her man was Cole. When we got to the house, it was midday, and we were the first ones to arrive. It gave me a chance to get to know his mom and dad and have their undivided attention focused on us. Both parents sat on a long couch across from us. There was a big window behind them overlooking their front deck. To the right, on the same wall as the window, is the front door. Arden and I both sat on recliners facing the parents in this big window. After talking with his parents for a while, I noticed a woman with dark, straight hair walk past the window. Her clothes were dark and plain. She could have had on a black sweater with how the sleeves went past her fingertips. She walks left to right past the window. I assume the side profile that I'd seen was Arden's sister, Valina, going to the front door. Their door has a large oval, slightly fogged glass panel. It's head level, just enough for me to see her face pressed against the glass. The oval window's light becomes blocked, filled with a truly ghastly grin. Her eyebrows were raised. I could see her prominent features, but the details of her face were too distorted by the fog aesthetic printed on the glass. A few moments go by and she hasn't opened the door. Doing my best to be polite and listen to Arden's mom tell me stories about him, I keep shooting glances over, trying to figure out if she needs help with the door or if she was waiting for her boyfriend before coming in. The face that she was making in the window was really giving me the creeps, so I kept my glances to a minimum. But the front door never opened, and nobody else walked across the deck to join her. I sneak another quick look at the front door, and I see a dirty black handprint smeared down the center panel where the face was. There's no longer anything visibly blocking the oval, and lights are once again glowing through the fogged glass. Nobody acknowledged the woman at the door, and she never came in. She also never left the deck, as there was only one way down onto the driveway from the porch, which involved passing by the living room window. And I can confidently say that I did not see the woman walk back across, as I was directly facing it. The large window stretched at couch length. I couldn't have missed it. But hours would go by without anyone new entering the house, enough time that I'd eventually forget about the woman, until we'd all hear footsteps on the 2 wooden steps leading up to the porch. Then, passing by the window was a teen with blue hair, styled in bright clothing picked straight from a Hot Topic bargain bin, followed in tow by a boy her age in the same fashion named Cole. I didn't know Valina was so much younger than Arden. The kids were nice, and I ate too many plates when dinner finally came. No idea who or what I saw that day outside the window, but it sure wasn't Arden's sister. In death row of Florida State Prison, in a back room is Old Sparky. Now I know many people think of Sing Sing Prison in the Green Mile movie, but the truth is most prisons share terms for places and objects. Now Old Sparky was the Florida State electric chair. It's still ready to go if they were to ever reinstall the generators. I had 2 interactions with this chair. They have orderly inmates shine the chair still, and a guard will have to watch them while they do it. I was acting as an auxiliary officer, coming from the prison next door, and being a death row officer by this point in my career, I drew the long straws, as my captain put it, and was put on detail for old Sparky. I know this isn't a very long story, but I believe that there is some negative attachment to that chair. I'm a generally healthy person, decent immune system, and not squeamish in any way. But when I would enter the room with the chair, I would get ill. Nausea, sweats, pains, anxiety. The closer I got, the worse I felt. The first time I was guarding the detail, I kept having to swap officers for a few minutes just to feel better. Finally, I just couldn't do it anymore. I talked to the shift lieutenant and explained that I was having issues in that room. And that's when I was moved to compound security. It's been about 6 months since I saw the apparition of a ghostly inmate. I built a reputation around this time as a solid officer, tough but very fair. I'd been assigned as area security. The area I was assigned as part of my job was to check fences and gates and act as an auxiliary officer in case our officers in the dorm needed to go smoke or something. It was about 2:30 a.m. Me and my partner Skylar were outside having a smoke. Now I'm an Army veteran with PTSD, and part of that is hyper-awareness. As I was smoking, I looked out onto the rec yard and saw shadows moving around back and forth against the perimeter lights. I motioned to Skylar to look, and he said, "Is someone on the yard?" "No, I don't think so." I went and grabbed the keys from the sergeant and grabbed my big mag light. We entered the yard and it was eerie. I shined my light towards where I thought I saw the shadows. Nothing was there, but at the far edge of my light, I'd see movement. After playing cat and mouse for about 20 or 30 minutes, Skylar called down to Tower 2 to turn on the yard lights. After he did, we searched for another 30. No one was there. Now the ground of the yard was loose sand substance that they called ballast. They would have inmates level it every time they were on the yard. So if anyone was on the yard, we could see their footprints. The only prints were mine and Skylar's. We went back flabbergasted. How was that possible? Still, to this day, I can't figure out that phenomenon. Has anyone ever witnessed shadows at the edge of their light? What is that? Skylar and I had experienced something together before that, though. This was when we were still in training. Back in the day, the prison I worked at and the prison where we trained were once part of the same prison, the Rock of Rayford. Where the Corrections Academy trains is part of an old death row housing. Now, this place was creepy. Not like Ghost Adventures creepy, but like a feeling that you're being watched. Me and my buddy Skylar were in the same class. We would go over to the old death row housing to get out of the Florida rain and have a cigarette. This is an old star-shaped building, 5 wings each holding 10 cells with a gun gallery in the center for the officers to sit in. If you stand in the middle of the officer station, you can see down all 5 wings. This will be important later. So me, Skylar, and our friend Eric, who was also a classmate, went and had a smoke. As we left the building, the classic beautiful Florida weather struck. Rain, thunder, and the whole shebang. We laughed at the weather's insanity while running to the other building. As we entered, the building was silent. Like, dead silent. All you could hear was the rain falling on the roof and outside. We approached the first gate, which is inside a ways. As we approached it, I kept having this weird feeling that we were being watched. We approached the old gun gallery, and Eric made a comment. "What is this place?" "Old death row housing and confinement," I told him. "Wow, this is so cool. Can I go in here?" As he approached the old gun gallery. "I don't think anyone cares anymore, man. This place has been closed since the 90s, Skylar said. Suddenly, we all heard a loud cough. Everyone became silent. "Jay, did you hear that?" Skylar asked. Yeah, but it's probably just the rain. Should we go check and make sure? I'm not going. Fuck that, Eric said. Finally, I said, I'll go check it out. You two keep an eye out. I pulled out my pen light and walked down the north wing where I heard the cough. It was an old space with windows that were busted out and the old-style jail bars. Cots still overturned, missing the mattresses, of course, but with bits of trash scattered about. Some of it looked like it may have been from prior inmates. As I got deeper into the wing, the hair stood up on my arms. I got goosebumps. Then I heard a noise like whispering. I raised my light, thinking that an inmate was hiding in there. Nothing was there. Then I heard the sound of shuffling and then running behind me. I took off and yelled, "Stop." I shined my light and nothing was there. I ran down the wing and yelled to Eric, asking if anyone had come down here. He was still standing in the gun gallery and shook his head. He yelled back, "No, just you. Why?" I told them both what had happened, and we elected to grab the instructor and were verbally warned to stay out of that building, to never speak of this or any paranormal happenings ever again, not on the compound. There is an old mining road past Granite Falls, Washington, one that people say is haunted. The mine itself, I'm sure, is too. Personally, I don't know how I feel about ghosts. I believe in them. I've seen them. And I've never been one to see something and live in denial about what I've seen, no matter how unreal it may be, especially to an outsider. You ever try to tell someone about your genuine experience and they unintentionally make you feel insane? Well, it happens. One time too many, so now I reserve my stories for people who at least have a desire to hear them. A skeptic is a lot more open-minded than a non-believer, that's for sure. Anyway, saying I don't know how I feel about them, what are they exactly? Like the man I've seen on this road. He's a disappearing act. Several people I know have reported seeing the same man or apparition of a man that I have, just past Silverton, right where Perry Creek sits. He's always walking in the same direction the cars are driving, always going east, meaning you never get to see his face. It's odd to see someone walking that way, but not really. The only reason to go out there would be to go into the woods, or if you have property out there. I don't, but my buddy does. It's not uncommon that we just paintball on his property or take the four-wheelers out. We do that a lot. But every once in a while, for the past 6 years, I've seen this guy walking. At first I thought, okay, a hiker or a tweaker. But no, he was dressed in some seriously old-looking clothes. He wore a floppy-style hat that I can't even place, suspenders and boots, and brown, worn-to-shit pants. I had to know what this guy's face looked like. Was he 25 or 85, you know? I instantly crank my head out the window to catch a glimpse of this guy, but as I do, he's just gone. He was nowhere. But there was nowhere for him to go. I tell my buddy, and he says, just wait, but I'll see him again. I asked him, who is this guy? He said, he's exactly what you think he is, dude. He's a ghost. As in, not real or not alive. He then tells me some stories about Lime Kiln Trail. That it's got an old abandoned mining town community still in it. Buildings still up and everything, just abandoned. People explore this place, and it's a literal ghost town, I guess. He said the whole woods are said to be haunted. The very woods that we ride around in all the time. I don't know. Maybe. But if so, I've never seen anything outside of this man on the road. But I'll give it to him. My buddy was right, and I've seen this dude a handful of times. He obviously had too, but it's more than that. It's like people all over know about this place, and I'm just learning about it. I don't fuck with caves or mines, so I won't be going there to find out if it's haunted or whatever. But I will say, the man on the road, he's a ghost. Each time was the same experience, almost. You'd pass him, and even if you didn't take your eyes off the man, he was gone the moment you actually passed him. One time I tried to drive slowly to see if I could holler at a ghost. Maybe they need a ride or something too, you know? He didn't react when I called out, but I slowly just kind of drove behind him. That's probably the time that I got the best look at his clothes. But regardless how long I drove like that behind him, he didn't react or behave any differently. Didn't respond to my calls, and eventually I just had to pass the guy. And of course when I did, he disappeared. I think the scariest time was the last time, which was at night. I had never really seen him during the night, maybe towards sunset, but I almost missed him entirely, which is what scared me so bad. The road is not one that you want to be walking down regardless, but at night, it's just idiotic. There's no streetlights, it's not heavily inhabited, and people like me drive fast down this road. I got to Perry Creek and wasn't thinking about the ghost at all, until something jetted in front of my truck. So quick that by the time I hit the brakes, it felt like it happened minutes ago, not seconds. I started driving slowly, looking around for just about anything, and I saw the man. Caught him at the edge of my headlights. He was back on the normal side of the road, headed in the same direction he always was. I don't know what came over me, but I remember actually yelling out my window, "You need to be more careful." Yeah, I had a good laugh about that one too. Couple of things, though, I still can't quite figure out. Why do I only see this guy when I'm heading east, but not west? Like, why is it that no one has yet to see his face? It's almost as though he's on a loop, and I just can't wrap my head around what all that means. As it turns out, my mom, dad, and cousin each have a story that takes place on the same patch of road in Mexico. I'll tell them as they were relayed to me individually. My parents actually met here in the United States, but they grew up in neighboring pueblos in Mexico. Connecting the two pueblos is a long, empty span of road, maybe 5 miles long, which is apparently haunted. These stories take place many years apart, but the exact same patch of road. The first story, my father's horse is distressed. When my dad was a young man, he loved horses, jerapos, and drinking. While he has since put down the bottle, he still loves horses and jerapos. Back in the day, he would occasionally ride his horse out across the road to the neighboring pueblos to hang out or hit up some parties. One early morning, he was returning home on horseback from a party in the neighboring pueblo. He was a bit drunk and was casually making his way home when suddenly the air grew still and the night went silent. He said something just felt off, and his horse could sense it as well. My dad says that you can always tell what a horse is focusing on by looking at their ears, and in this case, my dad's horse's ears were perked up stiff and focusing at the empty field beside them. Thinking that there might be some sort of animal stalking them, my dad looked around, but the fields beside them were empty, and there weren't any bushes or things for an animal to hide behind. Suddenly, the air went cold, and my dad felt goosebumps on the back of his neck, almost as if something was right behind him. That's when my dad's horse couldn't take it anymore and took off running for its life. My dad held on tightly and tried several times to bring the horse to a stop, but it was dead set on getting the hell away from whatever they had just encountered. Eventually, they finally reached their pueblo, and the horse calmed down and came to a stop. Never before or after had the horse behaved that way. This left my dad shook up. Needless to say, he was sober by the time he reached home. This next one, my cousin's passenger. My cousin is a few years older than me, so this story takes place many years after my dad's. One late night, my cousin was driving my uncle's pickup truck. He didn't make any mention of where he was heading or in which direction, but he said he was making his way across the same stretch of road. He said that he was driving along and all seemed very calm when suddenly he felt a presence in the vehicle. This pickup truck is one of those older two-door pickup trucks, which have a single long bench-style seat for the driver and passenger. My cousin says he felt the passenger side of the seat sink in, as if someone suddenly took a seat beside him. He said that experience scared him stiff and had him so shook up that he was cold sweating and crying. He was thinking that might be the moment he was going to die. Instinctually, he dared not turn around to face whatever it was sitting beside him, but the presence was so real, and he could even make out some sort of silhouette there beside him through his peripheral vision. After a couple miles of panic and sobbing, he eventually reached the neighboring pueblo, and the presence gradually faded away. He made it home safe, but the experience has scarred him. Now for the last one. My mom and cousin spot a hitchhiker. This last one is short, and it actually took place a couple of years ago. This happened to my cousin from the previous story and my mom. A couple of years ago, my mom went to Mexico to hang with family. Her return flight home was in the early morning, so my aunt had my cousin drive her to the airport. Along the way, on that same patch of road, they spotted a man hitchhiking on the side of the road. This was a very strange sight, as not many people hitchhike along that road. Much less early in the morning before the sun's even out. As you might deduce from the last couple of stories, land around the road is largely empty. There's not really any good reason to be out there at that time. Jokingly, my cousin suggested that they pick him up. They nervously laughed it off in the car and drove past the man. As they continued along, however, they swore they could hear someone whistling at them from out in the empty fields. This made them very nervous, and they wondered if the man, whatever he was following them. Eventually, they reached the neighboring pueblo, where they also swore they spotted him standing just outside the entrance. I've always kind of been fascinated by the mysteries of the deep sea, so when the opportunity arose to scuba dive in the murky depths of the Puget Sound, I couldn't resist. I knew very little about scuba diving, but I'd had an instructor with me, two in fact, as well as a small group of other very beginner divers. It was a super misty morning. A layer of fog was still over the water when we'd walked our way in. I was from Everett, but Mukilteo practically sits right beside it, but it's got some of the most beautiful views, and a spot well known for diving. Right between a beautiful hotel and some off-limits oil docks. The area is rather peaceful, to say the least, compared to the main beach or the lighthouse park. I found myself descending into the chilly waters off the coast. We weren't head under quite yet, but I could hardly wait to explore the world just beneath me and surrounding me. There was a period of time where I felt so comfortable I almost lost focus on the instructor and what they were saying. Luckily, it was all repeated. Finally, submerged. It was much quieter than I expected it to be. Only the sound of my own breathing through the gear mingled with the almost eerie silence. I navigated the underwater space through the kelp forests. I realized it was also darker than I expected. Everything, including myself, swayed with a gentle current. I was calm, and then I wasn't. An unexplainable unease began to settle within me. It was as if an invisible force would snatch me into the darkness at any given moment. It felt as if I was being watched for sure. I tried to tell myself, "You're with people. It's probably just an actual person." Though I knew deep in my gut, the same gut screaming for me to get away, there wasn't a fellow diver in those dark shadows of the water, but someone, something, watching my every move, was in the shadows. Just as I was about to resurface, a spectral figure materialized before me, underneath the surface. The ghostly apparition was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Translucent and ethereal, much lighter than the shadow it seemed to emerge from. It shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and at first I thought it was some sort of jellyfish, but I saw its eyes, as piercing as any bright light. Just for a moment, they were fixed on me, causing me to increase my speed to the surface. Still, I was so curious about what I'd seen. Surely those weren't eyes. Now that I'd had a moment to think, I considered that maybe I had in fact seen another diver, that the light had been their headlamp, too, somehow. I didn't have mine on at the time, but maybe I should have. I lowered myself closer to the seabed, trying to capture a glimpse of its presence again. But as I descended, to my sheer horror, the apparition was directly in front of me. At first, I thought it was mirroring my movements, but I realized, whatever it was swimming away. I rose to the surface again, realizing most of the divers were to the northeast of me. I was the furthest back. I swam closer to the group and descended underwater. I realized even from a distance the divers were much clearer. I could see their details clearly underwater. They weren't remotely transparent or shimmering in any way. I decided to try my luck one more time. I swam back in the direction I just explored, but I felt someone grab my leg. I was completely unprepared for the sensation, and it caused me to panic underwater. Summoning some remaining courage, I propelled myself away from the grip on my leg, my heart pounding in my chest. And even though I had oxygen, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I needed air. I felt it again, a strong pull on my leg. The water's current seemed to conspire against me, suddenly pushing me further into the sound, away from the safety of the surface, further away from the rest of the group. Just as I thought all hope was lost, an eerie stillness settled around me. There was no longer a grip on my leg, and I seized the opportunity to swim upwards with all of my might. Breaking through the surface and touching shore, I removed my headgear and gasped for air. Up to that point in life, I'd almost drowned twice. Been stung by a kind of jellyfish that hurt, and been thrown from a four-wheeler into a metal shed. But at that moment, my body was trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and relief like I'd never felt before. I don't doubt that the Puget Sound is a beautiful ecosystem worth exploring, and it's got several good spots. I've just never been back to that spot in particular. The memory of the underwater encounter, it's still vivid in my mind. I decided that I didn't really need to know what it was. Honestly, the moment it tried to pull me under or away, just pull it all, I was done. I'm finally ready to talk about the reason I went back to school last year. Before that, I was working on fishing boats. I don't have a wife or kids, so my time is my own. People always thought that it was weird that I enjoyed spending long stretches at sea, but I always thought that it was weird that they didn't. I figured it was one of those to each their own kind of things, but maybe they knew something I didn't, or just had better instincts. Most of the companies work similar to oil rigs. You go out with your crew for a few weeks, and then you come home to be off for a few weeks. I enjoyed my time off the same way that I did my time on, at sea. For every big industry boat, there are just as many day fishers. And it wasn't uncommon for me to help one out if they fell short-handed. Well, one morning during the summer of 22, I headed down to the docks in hopes of setting out with one of my day crews. My usual guys didn't have any openings, but I did notice a few summer boys arguing over where to find the gas tank, so I decided to introduce myself. Rich kids on college break were my favorite employers. There's no real work to do, so it's basically a babysitting gig. These guys wanted to take out Daddy's boat to get some good pictures for Instagram, but then they got to the docks and didn't know what to do next. There were 3 of them, but I probably shouldn't use their real names, so the owner's son can be Chad, and his buddies can be Sam and Dan. After gassing up, I made my sales pitch and they invited me right along. The only thing they cared about was catching one of those swordfish things. And being back before dark, the home before dark part was a piece of cake, but I'll circle back to the Marlin stipulation in a minute. I would have gone for free, but I didn't argue when they gave me $500. It was just before 8 a.m. when we left the dock for a small island that local kids sometimes use for parties. But people never go beyond that point because the other side is surrounded by tail, jagged rocks. One's hidden just beneath the surface. They'll put a hole in your hole before you realize what's happening, and they extend much further than you'd expect from such a small island. But the safe side is big. Like I said, kids party there all the time. I don't want it to sound like I recklessly took them to some dangerous location. We didn't even go to the actual island, only close enough to point it out. We anchored and began fishing around noon. Normally, I would have spent a good half hour explaining a few key differences between regular fishing and deep-sea fishing, but they had done zero research before the trip. With the bait that they had brought along, I didn't have to worry about them hooking a marlin or letting it get away with their poles. People like that never think about the fact that the fish will unhook itself. The first hour or so went exactly as I expected. Chad and Sam made some nice catches, but didn't want to touch the fish, so I kept taking them off the lines and rebaiting their hooks after the photo op. Dan, however, he learned to bait his own pretty fast because he kept getting robbed. It seemed like we had a good system worked out. After a few beers, I felt comfortable trying some of my own bait to see if I could catch the boys something worthy of posing with, but that turned out to be a nearly fatal mistake. While I was showing off to Chad and Sam, I realized Dan grabbed some of my bait, but even if I had, it really shouldn't have been that big of a deal. That just had to be the one time he set his hook properly. It was instantly clear that something was wrong when the entire boat lurched back hard enough to knock us on our asses. I shouted for Dan to let go, but he couldn't hear me over the loudest splash that I've heard in my life. I don't say that lightly. I've watched my captain fight a great white, and they make a hell of a fuss, but this sounded like a goddamn whale. I didn't need to see it to know that we were in danger. As I rose to my feet, there was a second giant splash, and a hard impact to our starboard side, knocking us all back on our asses. I scrambled to Dan, half crawling, half running, screaming to let go all the while. But as I got closer, I saw that he had. It was stuck on the rails, and he had been trying to turn it so that it would slide through. That's why I usually cover these things before the fishing begins. Once the panic starts, it's hard to utilize common sense. I began screaming, cut it, instead. But the words fell dead on my lips when the coil of a giant pale green serpent's body rose above the water and dropped onto the railing where the rod was stuck, smashing everything it impacted into splinters. The boat rocked to an almost 90-degree angle before slamming back into the water. Just before Dan could fall through the broken rails, I rushed to my feet to look over the side, just in time to see the last 6 feet of this tail disappear beneath the waves. I've spent my entire life on the ocean, but I've never seen anything like what we saw that day. It was like a giant anaconda left over from the Jurassic period. I've heard countless old sailors talk about creatures like it, but monster legends and sailing go hand in hand. Knowing what I do know now, it makes me wonder what other stories are true. And how many of the boating accidents by that island were actually from jagged rocks. Obviously, we returned to the docks immediately after that, but I haven't been able to go back out on the water since. The first classroom I taught in was haunted, or whatever you'd call it, by something more than just a ghost. It was evil, and it only went after the children. I used to teach preschool, and had been in the Reading School District since 2001. I left this preschool job shortly after all of this started happening. I'd been at the school for almost 2 years up to this point. 2 years of no events, and then suddenly, all hell seemed to break loose. I'd just moved into my new classroom, one that was tucked away on the east side of the building. It was smaller than most, but in fairness, my class was also the smallest, and I was technically the newest teacher on staff still. The room, it smelled a bit like mildew, as it had been previously used as storage. I did everything I could to make that room feel warm, but sadly it never did. Within the first weeks of kids being back in class, I was just getting to know my new kids, and so naturally this period of time just comes with a lot of learning about each kid, what makes them tick, their learning styles, where each kid is at with speech, etc. All of my kids were incredibly hesitant to use the sink inside the classroom. I assumed that they were adverse to washing their hands or water, so I taught them all the importance of hand washing in the big bathroom. And oddly enough, none of them seemed to have that same problem. Only they did again once we were back inside the classroom. 2 kids ended up with injuries before we'd made it through the first month, but it's the way the injuries occurred that caused me pause. The first child, it happened quite literally in front of me, but there was nothing to explain how it happened. The child was standing in front of myself and a group of kids. They were showing everyone how to do the itsy bitsy spider hand motions for the song. They weren't nailing it, of course, but it was cute and fun that a student had something they could share with everyone. As they're standing practically perfectly still aside from their hands, I watch as this kid's shirt collar is pulled away from his neck by some sort of invisible force, only to then proceed to yank the child backwards, pulling them down to the ground. Everyone sort of jumps back, inching closer to where I'm sitting. I plunged forward to grab the child who's understandably upset. As I'm consoling one child, the others gather even closer than before, and one of my kids, the strongest talker of the group, says, "Why did she hurt William, Miss Reese?" I didn't know how to answer the children, but I understand there's a time to lie and a time to tell the truth. So I said sometimes when the floor is wet, we can slip if we're not careful. All of the kids looked at me with a disappointing or disapproving look on their face, but I stood my ground and switched the subject to snack time. The second injury was just a couple of days after the first, but this one I didn't actually see, not fully. In our class, we have these cubbies that line the south wall of the classroom. They aren't very tall. I can reach on top of them very easily, but for preschoolers, they might as well be on top of the fridge. They aren't getting up there. As I'm helping one child with their coat, a little girl near the cubbies can suddenly be heard crying. I swiveled around, and there was blood streaming down her face, and it wasn't just her crying. There were several kids near her as well. There were a few other kids following me to the scene, and they were saying things like, "It flew," or "Why did she do that to her?" etc. Questions and comments that I didn't really understand, but I did search around for what could have hit the girl in the mouth. It was a wooden block. They're relatively heavy, definitely not meant to be thrown, but they were also clear on the other side of the room. The good talker of the class asks me something that at first meant nothing, but soon it changed everything. "Maybe we play with the board, Miss Reese. Maybe if we play, she'll leave us alone, Miss Reese." I didn't clarify. I just said something like, "We can't play a game right now, buddy. Maybe tomorrow?" But when I turned to face the kid, he's pointing at the ceiling above the sink. Still. I didn't react because I still didn't really understand what games would be up in the ceiling. I said as much, got the kids to their parents, and then I went back to my classroom to close up. Standing in my classroom that time, I couldn't take my eyes off the area near the sink, specifically the ceiling. It had bothered kids or grabbed their attention, one way or another, since class had started. I don't know about your classrooms, but mine consists of ceiling tiles that are easily removable and lightweight. Just push and they pop up. I knew I couldn't leave that classroom until I checked above the sink, so I found a small ladder and opened up one of the ceiling tiles. I didn't see anything, felt around a bit, just dusty. So I lifted another, and this time I did find something. A Ouija board. By the looks of it, an old one. I put it down almost as quickly as I picked it up. I didn't know much about this stuff to understand how dangerous it was, but I'd never heard anything great about them. I almost left it there. But this thing, whatever it was attacking kids. I couldn't let that continue. At the very least, I couldn't let the board stay. So I threw it away in the school's large dumpster. Several months would go by. No more strange events or injuries. Instead, I found the board again, tucked in the ceiling near the sink. I wouldn't have even thought to look again until my talker told me the board was back. I laughed, didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, I acted normal for the remainder of the day, and then immediately looked again once the kids were gone. I once again took the board to the dumpsters, only this time I decided to cut it up. The thing was practically falling apart on its own, so a couple tears and it was dust. I told my janitor what I'd done, asked that he keep an eye on the classroom for strange activity. He shrugged and went on his way, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to go back to that classroom. I called the next morning to inform my boss that I was going to have to visit family in Utah for a family emergency. A few days after that, I put in my 2 weeks' notice. Since I wasn't ever going back, I figured I'd be honest with her. Naturally, she didn't believe me, and instead probably thought that she'd gotten lucky, someone like me leaving on my own accord. But God, I'm so curious if she ever looked in the ceiling, and even more curious if it was still there. I mean, I'll never know because, well, I'm never going back. Hey all, 45-year-old widower here, and I need some help with a demon. A lot has happened to get me to this point, so I'm just gonna take you through this mess best I can. My wife, Tammy, died just under 2 years ago, during our son's freshman year of college. He took the rest of the semester off, but eventually we had to go back to our lives, so he returned to school after Christmas break. Then it was just me here, alone, with Tammy's memory, and I didn't handle that so well. I started drinking just to fall asleep at night, and next thing you know, bam, I was a full-on alcoholic. For a while, I thought it was under control because I was holding down my job. Turns out my boss was just giving me a little room because of my situation. But that grace period came to an end when I screwed up some paperwork that cost him north of $30,000. The customers appreciated the hell out of me, but somehow that didn't make much of an impact when I was begging John not to fire me. I thought being home alone all night was torture, but I didn't realize how much worse things could get. I had been ignoring my actual schedule and working 7 days a week from opening to closing, so I didn't have to go home. But now I was trapped here, 24/7. That's when the weird shit started happening. Now, I dream about Tammy all the time, and anyone who has lost a loved one knows how hard it is the first few moments after waking up. You forget what's happened, and for a few seconds, life feels normal again. Then reality comes crashing back, and you have to relive the grief again. See, that happens to me all the time, but occasionally, there's a twist to it. First, I should probably clarify that I've never experienced sleep paralysis before this, and I've always thought the paranormal was just superstitious nonsense. It's all in the months leading up to this. I never once considered seeing a psychic or trying to contact Tammy's spirit. The thought hadn't even occurred to me until she started talking to me in my dreams. During the second week of November, I had my first experience. From the very beginning, I knew it wasn't a normal dream. I wasn't reliving old memories or seeing visions of Tammy's accident. I was in bed, alone, and the only source of light came from a dimming street lamp outside my window. It was just bright enough to reveal a shadowy figure looming next to the door, which I assumed to be an intruder. I tried to jump out of bed, but I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move a muscle. I was just stuck lying on my back as this person slowly inched closer. They moved like they hadn't noticed that I was awake. I didn't know who it could be or what they wanted, but then they passed by the window, and I saw it was Tammy. There was no period of confusion where I thought she was still alive. I was fully lucid. The first thought was, this is the realest nightmare I've ever had, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. She didn't look like ghosts do in the movies, not unless it's horror. This wasn't one of those lovely visions where she's at peace or gives me her blessing to move on. No. She looked like she randomly decided to come home and crawled out of her grave. She was on her way to the grocery store when a giant dually truck came flying off on an exit ramp and killed her on impact. The other driver died as well. Apparently, he had left a bar to go pick up a friend. The damage was so bad. I'm sorry. I really can't handle describing it in detail, but she suffered massive trauma. And now she was standing there like she had just stepped out of the wreckage. After she passed the window, the darkness once again distorted her features, but only until she was directly next to me. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and suddenly became very much the image of what you would see in a movie. She was glowing and beautiful. She smiled, and all the fear melted away, forgotten. She said that she was still here, unable to move on, and needed my help. Then her soft glow faded back into a shadow and disappeared entirely. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in the morning. I fully believed it was only a dream, but it freaked me out, and unlike other dreams, it didn't fade as the day wore on. I couldn't get it out of my head. Later the next evening, I was watching TV in the den, and Tammy's recliner suddenly popped open, exactly as if she'd sat in it. We have two big leather lazy boys that are pretty worn in. All you gotta do is sit down and slightly lean back for them to pop open. But they've never just randomly opened by themselves. I heard the noise it made when she would sit down. I know you all know what I mean. That distinct sound of the leather stretching and the springs squeaking. I looked over in confusion to literally see an imprint of someone sitting there as the chair leaned back and the footrest came out. A few nights later, I had another nightmare where I woke up paralyzed again. It started with the same horrifying image of Tammy after her accident, but she was glowing by the time she sat next to me. And again, she said something about being stuck here, but she almost sounded far away. Then, the last thing I was able to understand was something about a box in the back of her closet. When I woke up in the morning, there was an awful stench of rotten meat. It almost made me forget about the dream, but then I thought of how random the thing about Tammy's closet was, and I wondered if I smelled something in my sleep. Like maybe my subconscious decided it was coming from the closet. All of Tammy's stuff is exactly where she left it, because I just can't bear to go through it. But I had to get rid of that smell. Well, the only thing I found was a birthday present and a card that she never got to give to me. It had never even occurred to me that she had probably already gotten one. I sat on the floor reading the card over and over for a long time, before suddenly realizing the bad smell was gone. I couldn't explain it any more than a dream leading me to that present. So that's when I learned about sleep paralysis on the internet. It kept popping up all over my search results, and most of it matched the actual experience perfectly. Then I started looking into ghosts and reading about other people who claimed to be visited by a dead spouse. I read a lot of stories where someone lost their partner unexpectedly, and neither party could move on, not until they were able to say a proper goodbye. That really seemed to fit with the parts where Tammy said that she was stuck. Well, I couldn't afford to hire a psychic, not while I'm living off of savings and insurance, so I decided to talk to Tammy herself. I might be a sorry piece of shit these days, but the one line I won't cross is driving drunk. I couldn't bear to do to someone else what that bastard did to us. Instead, I overnighted a Ouija board and some candles from Amazon. It didn't work right away. In fact, I almost quit. But then the glass slider piece actually started moving. I about shit myself. But Tammy basically confirmed almost everything that I had assumed. She didn't have the closure that she needed to move on and needed help. But that's as far as we got the first night, because it just suddenly stopped working. Still, for the first time, I had hope again. I drank less and less to the point that I hadn't realized I was down to a 6-pack a day. More things started happening around the house. Sometimes I heard footsteps, or it would suddenly get really cold. During the next sleep paralysis incident, she appeared in glowing form from the beginning. I didn't have to see the nightmare version at all. That time, she said she was getting stronger and asked me to use the board again, saying that she would keep getting stronger until we could have a real conversation. She didn't have to tell me twice. I started using that thing every night, and we talked a little more each time. Occasionally, I smelled the rotten meat again and woke up in a cold sweat. But other times, I would feel a hand on my shoulder or hear her voice and draw strength from it. Then came the night when I had my most intense sleep paralysis episode yet. It felt as real as writing this letter right now. I thought that it was time to say goodbye, but that's not what she wanted. She wanted to be together again, all of us. When our son came home for Christmas, she expected both of us to join her. She even suggested ways to do it. That's when I knew this thing wasn't Tammy. In my research, I'd seen more than a few cautionary tales, but I never actually read any of them all the way through. I just really wanted my case to be one of the real ones. Deep down, I knew there was something wrong. No one else's stories involved stenches of rotten meat or seeing their loved ones mangled. Certainly, they hadn't been asked to harm themselves or others, at least not until I started reading about demons. I'm trying really hard not to start drinking like I was again, but this has all been too much. I've been ignoring it for the last week, and it's just getting angrier and angrier. It pounds on the doors so hard that they shake, and it tries to slam them when you're passing through. I've woken up with scratches on my neck, my back. My son comes home for Christmas in 5 days. I'm afraid for his safety, but if I say why, he'll think that my drinking has gotten worse. Well, seeing is believing, so maybe we'll go to my brother's once he knows I'm not crazy. Of course, I would much rather get rid of this thing. I'm willing to try a priest, but I don't go to church, and the ones I've called have all hung up on me. I even visited a few, but they ended up asking me to leave. I really don't know what to do. I live in a city 6 hours away from my hometown, so I can only really afford to drive back for the holidays. Sadly, my mom passed away earlier this year, and I hadn't been able to visit her grave since the funeral. I felt awful about not being able to make the drive sooner, so I really wanted the cemetery to be my first stop when I got to town. Well, I've never been the most punctual person, and it ended up being past midnight when I finally arrived. I wasn't frightened of being in a cemetery so late, but I was ready for some sleep and trying to move fast. The only problem is that it's a really big cemetery, so I got a little turned around trying to find her. After at least 5 or 10 solid minutes of aimless wandering, I realized I had to pee really bad. I hadn't used the bathroom since leaving the house 6 hours in a giant Route 44 power rate ago. It was so late, and I was so far away from the road that I really didn't see anything wrong with stepping away from the graves and relieving myself on a tree. Sue me, I was dying. Afterwards, I decided to make the loop one more time before calling it quits, but right before the turnaround point, I suddenly heard a set of footsteps behind me. I spun around, shocked that anyone else would be there, but I saw no one. That freaked me out. I was positive that I had heard someone on the narrow concrete path just behind me. I called out a few tentative hellos, but there was no response either. Creeped out, I quickened my pace and focused more on getting back than looking for Mom. Ahead, a stretch of the pathway was lined with shady trees on either side, forming a dark tunnel. Inside, there was a tall, dark shadow figure, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. The sight of it made my blood run cold. It's like it was radiating malice. I've never felt such a sudden and intense shift in the very atmosphere. When I called out another hello, it turned and began charging towards me. I was so startled that I fell over backwards and sat there frozen until the shadow man vanished a few feet away from me. And just like that, it was gone, and the only thing left was a blast of cold air. When I calmed down enough to rise, I walked around the tunnel of trees, too frightened to walk beneath them, and I hurried back to my car. But I think it followed me to my dad's house. We'd never experienced anything remotely paranormal there, yet that night something woke us up, banging on the front door just after 3 a.m. I had been in bed for less than an hour when it happened. Dad came to the entryway a few seconds after myself, and we stared at the Ring doorbell camera as nothing pounded on the door like we owed it money. Worried that it would wake the neighbors, Dad ripped it open mid-knock, and everything fell instantly silent. There was nothing and no one outside. Not knowing what else to do, we returned to bed and slept the rest of the night, but things only got worse over the following days. We've seen stuff fall off of shelves without being touched. Weird cold spots will randomly form and disappear all around the house. And last night, Dad saw a tall shadow figure standing at the foot of his bed. Now it's worth noting, I didn't tell him anything about my experience at the cemetery. He's always been a very logical man. I didn't want him to worry about me losing my mind. Yet he saw the exact thing that I saw, and even felt the same thing that I felt. He said that it gave off such an intensely evil aura that he had never even considered the possibility of an intruder. Whether it was a demon, Satan himself, or something else entirely, he had no clue, only that it wished him harm. He was frozen with fear, and despite having the heat cranked up to a ridiculous 74, it was cold enough to see his breath. Eventually, it disappeared into thin air, and he fell back asleep. He described it to me as a nightmare, but he was so shaken up that I can tell he doesn't believe it was a dream. If I hadn't experienced what I did, or even if I had just told him what had happened, I could probably convince myself that's all it was. But come on, I don't know what to do about any of this. I just know that I can't bring a demon or whatever this is back into his house and then go back to school after New Year's. I can't. God knows he's been through enough. Well, we both have. So I guess my real question is, am I right about this thing being a demon? And if I am, what the hell do I do now? I tried Googling it, but that was pointless. I don't even know where to begin. I didn't realize how complicated all of this stuff could get, and I just want to be done with it. I'm going to tell Dad everything as soon as he gets home from work. Then maybe we can figure it out together. After what he saw last night, I don't think I'll have any trouble convincing him. Okay, well, wish me luck, I suppose. Apologies if this story feels scattered. Something new just happened, so I'm trying to get it all down before it leaves my brain, though I'm not sure that's ever going to happen. I guess I'm looking for advice. So first off, before tonight, 3 weeks ago exactly, my girlfriend Kayla and I experienced something strange while walking from my car to my house. Just as we approached the doorway, we both heard what sounded like laughter. We stood there silently for a moment, listening carefully. I think we both felt that the laugh wasn't one that we recognized. Even more so, it felt manufactured. A combination of a high-pitched voice and an unnaturally low voice, in unison. We didn't hear it again after standing there, so we thought nothing of it, decided to go inside. When we walked into the living room, I was expecting to see a movie being played on the TV, but instead, the TV was off and I see my best friend, his girlfriend, and one of her friends are all sitting around the coffee table in front of the couches. Probably playing Monopoly again. These two loved games, so I felt it was a safe assumption. When we walked in, the three of them practically jumped from sitting to a standing position, followed by exhales of relief when they set eyes upon the two of us. Who else did they think was going to be coming in anyway? I shrugged it off and we walked over to see what they were really up to. They'd reclaimed their seated positions, and as I got closer, I realized they were using a Ouija board. "What the hell?" I asked, almost laughing. My best friend responds while rolling his eyes. "Julia's idea. His girlfriend's friend." I sort of laugh and tell him to have fun, and I start to walk to my room. But instead of following me, Kayla says that she wants to do it too. "Do what?" I asked. "The board." Before I could say anything, Julia pipes up. "Sorry, but we already started the session. It's bad luck to bring in newcomers mid-session." I laughed. I was sorry, but I couldn't help it. Was she serious? How could anything possibly be bad luck when it came to a board game? Laugh all you want, but we can't just introduce someone new. Sorry. I guess part of me felt like they were making Kayla feel bad. I didn't know why, but it just seemed silly to me. But then Kayla said something that surprised me. "Oh no, I totally understand. I don't want to mess with something you guys already have going on. Next time, though." Everyone agreed, and then I was following Kayla to my room. We messed around, played video games for hours before finally deciding to go to sleep. Kayla fell asleep instantly. I, on the other hand, I couldn't shake this very uncomfortable feeling I had. Laying there, I tried to figure out why I was feeling this way. Without even really thinking, I was just looking around my room. The feeling, it was as if someone were watching me use the bathroom or something really personal. I was laying in bed and not half as vulnerable, but that's just how it felt. I felt like I was tossing and turning all night. In the morning, Kayla said that she woke up a few times. Each time, I was asleep. She sounded concerned, though, not just making an observation. So I asked her, "Did something happen?" Hesitantly, she tells me that, yeah, one of those times something did happen. There's a street light close to my house, specifically on my side of the house, and you can often get a glow of light in the room from it. The window itself appears lit up because of this. She was unable to fall back asleep and considered using the bathroom. Before getting out of bed, she had an intense feeling that she should look at the window. When she did, she saw a handprint form on the glass. Kayla told me it was as though someone had made condensation and then placed their hand there. She was only able to look at it for a couple of moments before it disappeared, just as a real handprint might do under the same conditions. I was disturbed, honestly. My first thought wasn't even about the board, because, for the record, I'd never even bothered to consider what a Ouija board was, besides the basis of some scary movies. I thought someone was outside my window. I didn't want Kayla to think I didn't believe her, but I had to know, so I asked some clarifying questions. "You saw a hand form, but no hand? Like, was there a person standing out there, or?" She said that there was nobody there. The handprint appeared on its own accord, not attached to an entity or a person. I know Kayla well enough to know there's no reason for her to make this up. She didn't seem to be having fun anyways. She was actually expecting me to explain it to her, but how could I? I told her that I had no idea what the hell it could have been. Any chance it was a dream? Yeah, that question didn't go over well. I believed her, though. She described feeling like she was being watched after that. She said she almost woke me up. So what was it? A real person, a ghost, a demon, a dream? Honestly, it didn't matter at this point. Something did feel seriously wrong about the whole experience. I took her home later that morning, and on the way out, we see that the group had passed out in the living room, with the TV on and the board still open on the table. "Huh, wow," Kayla said in almost disbelief at the sight. "They didn't even put the board away? I sure as hell hope they said goodbye." On the ride to Kayla's house, she explained to me everything that she knew about Ouija boards. She said she trusted the group because they had started quoting rules when she asked to join. She assumed they knew what they were doing, but now she wasn't so sure. According to Kayla, spirit boards, as she calls them, are tricky. They have rules and they come with risks. She told me that she actually used one twice before, never had a negative experience. She'd followed the rules. I dropped Kayla off and she told me I needed to ask my roommates if they said goodbye and to also ask if they had any weird experiences since using the board. I was still sitting between skeptic and believer in this situation. I believed Kayla, but I'm just skeptical in general. I decided to look everything up that she told me, and I found it online. There's so much more information out there than I could have even imagined, like real stories of people using these boards and having seriously shitty luck, or genuinely terrifying experiences. One woman recounted that she'd been physically removed from her bed in the middle of the night after using one, and she had scratches on her leg and claimed that a demon had given them to her while yanking her out of bed. Sure, these could be fabrications, but the amount of information gave me major pause. Basically, I found several different sources that echoed what Kayla had said to me about the necessity of saying goodbye. What I didn't find were a ton of positive experiences. Even the ones that started that way seemed to end in horror. People believing they were talking to loved ones, only to realize that it was something else. So I asked my roommates, "Did you all say goodbye?" They all agreed that they had said goodbye, and that they hadn't had any strange experiences. I honestly don't know if I believe them. The following weeks were pretty uneventful, so much so that I started to feel like a nut for going down that rabbit hole. The only thing that hasn't gone back to normal was Kayla. She was no longer wanting to stay the night at my house, so we got into a routine of driving her home late at night, picking her up in the morning. Kayla lives with her parents about 2 miles away from my place. We both live in residential areas that are not heavily occupied. Our neighbors aren't stacked on top of each other. We've got space in between. But Kayla has a lot more space in between. And unlike my street, hers is a long stretch that eventually turns to gravel and has limited streetlights. Our routine is for me to park before the driveway and then walk her to the door. The reason for this is because her parents' bedroom is positioned in a way that any headlights in the driveway would shine directly into their room. So, cut to tonight. I parked my car under one of the few streetlights, and we got out to walk towards her house. A few steps away from the car, we're basically walking in darkness. This part hasn't ever scared us before, but tonight, we seem to walk closer to one another, and we both seem to pick up the pace at the same time. Walking through the darkness, maybe 30 feet from her driveway, we freeze. We'd heard that same manufactured laugh that we'd heard outside my house 3 weeks ago. The high-pitched voice seemed to scream over the lower, unnatural voice. But like the first time, in unison. I felt both of our bodies tense. The grip on each other's hands intensified. Without words, we both just booked it back to my car. I practically threw Kayla in the car and scrambled to the driver's side. After sitting in the car for what I consider to be too long, Kayla says that she thinks she wants me to drop her off in the driveway, explaining she doesn't mind if her parents wake up tonight. Once in the driveway, neither of us wants to budge, so I bite the bullet and I get out of the car. I get her out of the car and we practically run to her front door. I didn't want to admit it and still don't, but I was fucking scared. I told her that I would be fine though, and I would call her in the morning. I'm not even home yet, just sitting in my car at a brightly lit Shell station. No idea what I'm waiting for, and I know I'm not going to get any responses before I inevitably have to go home, but it sure would be nice to wake up to some answers. Is there any possible way that we're actually dealing with a demon? If that's even possible, what the hell do we do? There's a chance nothing else happens, but am I kind of screwed, seeing as this took place in my house? Like, is it possible for something to attach itself to either one of us, even though we didn't touch the board? I guess the big question is, do I need to move? I live in an area pretty close to a park and a retirement facility, so my neighborhood is, for the most part, pretty uneventful. It's nice by all accounts. Next door to my building is a large field. Sometimes on the weekends or even in the evenings after work, I see random groups of people playing games of soccer or hosting some sort of team workout event if it's still light out. Outside of those kinds of things, the park is relatively empty. I like to walk there in the mornings, just basically a few laps around the perimeter of the field. At the far end is some woods, and it's just kind of calm. At night, I do sort of avoid it because it's pretty dark. No lighting system around the area besides the buildings. So, a few nights ago, I was out for a late-night walk. I was enjoying the freezing cold that is the winter right now, and the peacefulness of the practically empty but still well-lit streets. I was about to pass the field on my right, heading towards my go-to convenience store, when I noticed a figure in the distance, crouched down. At first, I thought that it was a stray dog, wandering aimlessly in the night, stopping to sniff something. I'd never seen one before, but it seemed possible given its stature. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to approach the dog, cautiously, of course, but as I got closer to the thing, something felt off. The dog seemed to look less like a dog the closer I got, so I stopped moving. Then, it stood upright on its hind legs, its eyes fixated on me. Were they glowing or just really bright colors? I guess I don't know for sure. I just stood, frozen. I was unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. Even now, how do I describe what I saw without it sounding absurd? It's not possible, I don't think. This dog, or whatever this thing was, with a dog-shaped head, dog-shaped feet. To my horror, it began to walk backwards a few feet. Then it stopped abruptly, turned its body to the right, and continued walking backwards, into the field and out of view. I'd have to pass whatever the hell this thing was in order to get to my destination, or I could just go home. I recalled its movements. They were unnaturally smooth. I recalled it staring at me. A strange sensation had washed over me. It was as if I had been pulled into a trance. I couldn't move, couldn't escape the gaze of those eyes. It was only a few moments that felt like an eternity. I had already decided that I was going to turn around and go home. It was the obvious choice, and I was making my way when I heard a horrifying howl, more like a guttural, loud growl. It was distant, but not by much. Something told me that something was terribly wrong. Call it instincts, or maybe that's just what deep fear feels like. I picked up my pace and I was running. I don't run, not for exercise, but I booked it like never before. Panic had just kind of taken over. I didn't stop until the growl was completely gone and I was at my own door. I've played the whole series of events in my head 1,000,000 times. I've tried to draw this thing. I've tried to compare it to things that I've seen online, and truly I just have no idea. I'm just insanely curious and a little terrified, wondering, what did I see that night? If anyone knows something or has any ideas, please, I welcome you to shed some light on this new mystery that seems to haunt me all the time now. Years ago, I started dating this girl named Janie. We sat near each other at work, and I basically fell in love with her the day we met. She lived with her brother in a shadier part of town. Her brother worked late nights and was never at their house. The duration of her staying in that house, I only met him once, which was a plus. But he also owned a big, scary, untrained dog. It stayed at the house, named Spud. This dog was intimidating, and not just because it was a pit bull. The first time I spent the night at her house, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, which was downstairs. When I rounded the corner to hit the second set of steps, there was Spud, standing in a fighting position at the bottom of the stairs, blocking the bathroom, growling intently at me. That was a long night. On the days I'd accompany Janie home from work, she'd get Spud on a leash and we'd take him out for a walk just to get some of that insane energy out. We would take a walk around the neighborhood baseball fields and I'd watch this ridiculously buff animal drag my Janie around. She leans all of her body weight backwards to keep Spud from knocking her off balance as we walk. Each step we take, Spud is up front. His leash is always tight with tension as grass chunks rip up under his massive paws as he lunges and tugs, trying to get every inch. One late night, I'm over watching a movie and Janie needs to take Spud out to go potty before we go upstairs. We bundle up and we go to make a loop around the baseball fields. She and I have done this time to time, plenty of nights, and Janie's been doing it since before we even met. Two objective truths. The area Janie lived in was really bad, like stepping over junkies on the sidewalk getting to her doorstep. Never see a cop kind of place. But nobody was going to fuck with her seeing this monster jumping and lunging at the end of a leash. We brought a blunt to spark at the park. I stuffed almost a full dub sack in there trying to flex for Janie. I'm not mentioning it to try to flex now, but so you can feel the same thing we were feeling at the time. I mean, this was back in the day where you'd have to call up a local dealer who may or may not have weed to sell, who may or may not want to travel or be available on the day that you run dry. You'll never know the struggle we had to go through for a sack of that sweet Mary Jane. Actually, I guess a lot of people probably still do have to struggle for that, but just not me. Anyway, as we're walking down a small hill approaching the baseball diamond, we're planning on going into the third base dugout to light up. But as we're getting closer, Spud lets out a tremendous bark. The sound shakes my attention, and I look away from Janie, panning straight ahead. There, we both see this guy standing on the other side of the field, near the baseball line. He's barely a silhouette against the dark background of the trees and trails. We're continuing forward, but he remains frozen. Spud's just beginning to settle down as we get into the dugout. With the leash still tightly wrapped around Janie's hand, she asks to spark the blunt, and I hand it to her along with the lighter. I'm still keeping an eye on the guy, frozen in the dark. I don't know why we didn't leave. Again, probably because we had Spud there. But just as Janie puts the blunt up to her lips, the man whistles a couple of high woot-woots. Before there's time to blink, Spud is up and tearing ass out of the fenced-in dugout, taking Janie along with him and heading towards the guy. When she falls, the blunt lands under her and gets dragged into shredded dust as her body is pulled across it. But obviously that's the least of my worries, as I'm watching my girlfriend get ripped from this cage by a monster dog while he's trying to attack a strange man that's been standing in the dark. I got up and threw myself onto her just in time to watch Spud rip the leash again. All the strain that was being put on Janie's hand from the leash finally released with a violent pull that breaks 3 of her fingers. She starts screaming, and all I can do is scream, "Watch out," as Spud closed ground on the man. He remained frozen while this dog rushed at him. I for sure thought that I was about to see this man get ripped to shreds. I'm holding Janie and hollering for Spud to come back, come back. Janie tells me that she's fine, but begs me to please go get Spud. So without hesitation, I run towards 2 things that I'm currently scared of. But as I'm running, I notice that Spud is just sitting calmly in front of this dark silhouette of a man. It's so jarring to see that I stopped running. I was close enough now to where I should be able to see the man, but he's still just a body of darkness. I call out again for Spud, but no reaction from either of them. I hear Janie yelling, "Grab him." So again, I head towards the shit that I'm afraid of. Just as I approach, the man drops his hood. His face was normal, but his eyes were not. This man has pitch black eyes. And sure, they could have been contacts, but his whole dressed as death thing with a stone cold face weren't helping matters either. I said fuck it, and I reach for the leash. As I grabbed it, Spud turns around and bites my fucking arm. I drop the leash instantly, and Spud takes off. Janie is screaming for me to follow him, and she stops mid-sentence and just starts screaming in general. I look up, and Spud is halfway across the field, running full speed, heading in the direction of the woods. But even fucking crazier than that, Death Dude is already gone. Janie has now made it halfway to me, and she's crying and yelling, "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" I grab her and I say that we can go after him, but he bit me. And she looks at me and says, "That guy just disappeared. Dis-fucking-peared right in front of us. He vanished. What the fuck?" I calm her down and we decide that we need to get ourselves cleaned up and then look for Spud. When we reach her front door, there's Spud, sitting stoic at the front door, just waiting to get let in. Janie is so relieved, so that part makes me happy. But that dog, I don't know. I know it's a shitty thing to assume an animal is evil and all, but there's something so unsettling about that whole situation, all the way up to him sitting there. I did not trust this dog. Oh, and Janie's my wife now, so we still talk about this situation quite a bit, especially the whole vanishing man part. We still have no goddamn idea how to explain that one. But for curiosity's sake, we'd love to know what other people think. The other night I was in bed. I know I wasn't entirely asleep because I could hear the sounds of the house, and I was technically meditating. So my eyes were closed. I felt relaxed, focused on my breathing. I found myself suddenly opening my eyes. I'd been on my way to sleep, but now I was totally alert, my senses heightened for seemingly no reason. I felt a subtle movement in my legs, but that didn't immediately alert me since it's my dog's favorite place to sleep. I was wide awake now and sitting upright, and I witnessed a shadowy figure gracefully rise from the comfort of the end of my bed and silently walk away, making its way towards the exit of my room. With my dog nestled at the foot of my bed, I usually feel a sense of peace that envelops the room when I see this sight. This particular night, that familiar calm was accompanied by the shadow that emerged from where my dog lay. The feeling wasn't replaced by a negative one, but this time it was as if the very essence of the room had also taken form and manifested as this mysterious silhouette. I guess all this to say that the whole experience was really positive. Sure, at first it felt a bit eerie, and I didn't understand why I was awake, but the calmness was the same. There was still tranquility, and my current dog wasn't bothered by the experience at all. I couldn't help but wonder what the shadow's presence was as I laid there in bed. Was it something more than just peaceful? Was it familiar? Recently, I'd lost my grandma, and the night that I'd had this experience, I'd just celebrated 4 months clean and sober, which doesn't sound like a lot, I know, but it's the longest I've done in a long time, and I intend to take it one day at a time. Maybe it goes without saying for anyone who's done any sort of recovery work, but I've been doing a lot of praying, hoping that alcohol will never find its place in my life again. During this process, somehow I've felt that lately meditation, or at least just taking time to be mindful and express gratitude, even if it's just silently, I've believe that we become attuned to even the subtlest energies that surround us, even those of our dearly departed. I have to wonder, was the shadow the spirit of my grandma, visiting from the realm beyond to offer solace and encouragement? Or perhaps it was the manifestation of another being altogether, drawn to the energy of transformation that's hopefully permeating my space. Regardless, the shadow left an impression on me. As I laid there, contemplating the significance of the encounter, I sort of felt a renewed purpose in my recovery. I truly hope to have similar experiences again in life, but I'm so curious how many others have had similar experiences to mine. In my mid-20s, I worked at a subacute rehab facility. Generally, these places exist to help those who are struggling after an accident or surgery, etc. Helps regain their mobility and quality of life with the help of physical therapy and around-the-clock nursing care. I worked in the dementia unit. These patients were long-term and most ended up living out the rest of their lives there. Although it was called the dementia unit, our patients were comprised of those suffering from permanent or long-term brain-related conditions. These included dementia, Alzheimer's, comas, strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and brain tumors. These are the experiences I had while working there. 1. A disembodied hand. I had just clocked in for the evening and I received a report from the day shift nurse. I was standing at the end of the hallway with my back against the wall, reviewing the notes that I'd taken from the previous nurse. Whilst reading over my slip of paper, I felt what could only be described as a hand dragging its fingers horizontally across my abdomen. I jerked back and looked around, but I was completely alone. 2. The Call Light Symphony. Although I don't have a particular story about the call lights, it was a normal occurrence to have call lights in empty rooms triggered. Even in rooms where the wires attached to the call button were unplugged from the wall, some nights the nurses would be forced to respond to several phantom calls for empty rooms. 3. The empty room ghost. At the very end of one of our halls contained a habitually empty room. The heat/air conditioning unit was broken, so patients were never placed there. The nurses and aides would use that room for privacy during personal phone calls, to poop in peace, or whatever else required some seclusion. One evening, I headed into that room's bathroom to touch up my makeup and fix my hair. I left the door slightly ajar while going about my business. I was putting my hair up in a bun when the bathroom door slammed shut behind me. Mid-heart attack, I spun around and jerked the door back open. The room was empty. The time it would have taken a human to exit the room would have been longer than what it took me to open the bathroom door. I'd also like to note that there was no furniture in the room, nothing a human could have hid behind. I'm convinced it wasn't a living person who slammed that door. 4. The Last Farewell. One patient we had residing in the long-term unit was a middle-aged woman with severe Down syndrome. She was mostly nonverbal, save for a couple of words she would utter randomly. She was very sweet and always had a smile on her face. It was my turn to help her eat dinner the night this story takes place. She didn't have the motor skills to eat properly, so I spoon-fed her while we caught up on some cartoons on her TV set. But this particular night, she acted completely out of character. I didn't notice at first because I was engrossed in the show we were watching. I failed to notice her attempts to get my attention. She finally resorted to using grunts to call me away from the TV screen. When I did finally notice, she seemed overjoyed with something. Her mouth was stretched into a wide grin, and she was pointing at an empty dark corner in the back of her room. I could clearly see the corner, but nothing else. I looked back and forth between her and the corner, but I couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. She was pointing, giggling, and waving at apparently nothing in the corner. I tried asking her what she was trying to show me, simple yes or no questions that she could nod and shake her head to. I became uneasy with her actions because I knew she was seeing something I could not. After I finished up feeding her, I walked back out into the hallway and was immediately approached by a fellow nurse. My stomach sank, and I felt queasy while she told me that the next-door neighbor of the woman I was just feeding had passed away during dinner time. 5. The Window Watcher. Not my story, this was told to me by a fellow nurse. My friend, let's call her Mary. She worked the night shift at the same rehab as I did, but this story takes place years before I was hired there. Mary was close to one of her patients, and she went out of her way to make her feel special. The patient was an elderly woman with no living family and was chronically lonely. Let's call the patient Emily. When Mary bonded with Emily, it became a habit of Emily's to wait by her room's window, which faced the employee parking lot. So when she saw Mary walking up to the building, she could wave. This became a special occasion for Emily, and the two would wave to one another before and after Mary's shift while she traveled to and from the employee parking lot. Then Emily fell ill and was unable to get out of bed for a while. Every time Mary pulled up for work, she would check to see if Emily was waiting by the window. When she didn't see her, she would know walking in that Emily was sick. This went on for a few weeks. Mary would pull into the parking lot, hoping to see her sweet patient up and out of bed, waiting patiently to wave at her. But then one day, Mary showed up at work and saw Emily standing at her window, peering out over the employee parking lot. Mary was thrilled and hopped out of her car and gave Emily a gleeful wave. But Emily stood motionless, didn't react to Mary's exuberant greeting. Puzzled, Mary headed into the building only to quickly find out Emily passed away earlier that day. Well, I hope you enjoyed these stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them.